Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
Hi everyone, I don't feel like I need to raise my voice. This is so beautiful and intimate. I love it. This is almost how we started, I think 5 years ago. It was such a beautiful feeling in the room. So I really appreciate everyone being here. It's a bit of a weird vibe out there in the city. We're talking about that. So it's great to have you all here. So my name is Naomi, if I haven't met any of you before. We run the office space, which is upstairs in this beautiful building. And we're super passionate about community and building businesses. And a huge part of that is, of course, leadership. And we're going to jump into that topic. But first, I do want to give a welcome to country. An acknowledgement of country. So we meet on the land of the Eora of the Gadigal Nation, and I want to acknowledge the leaders and elders past, present and emerging, and also to thank everyone that's here for the ticket sales that they go to the Sydney Community Foundation, and that's a program that we've been proud to support for the last 5 years. So it's a business incubator for disadvantaged and immigrant women. So again, thank you for the past 5 years of support, I guess, and some new faces here that are part of the journey with us. So for our final series of not just 2019, but the decade, which is a little bit crazy, we wanted to look at what constitutes true leadership going forward into 2020. So I was reflecting on this, and I think 2019 has brought us some incredible leadership examples. So the perennially outstanding Bill and Melinda Gates, the extraordinary Jacinta Ardern, who, despite being New Zealand's youngest Prime Minister since the 1800s, has done the most incredible reforms. And there's a really great YouTube clip. I think she has to list in 2 minutes all her achievements, and she goes over because she's done so much. But on so many levels, she's smashing so many ceilings. And then to go younger again to 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, whose leadership by example saw, I think, from one person protest, welcome Boris, she's had 80,000 people in Sydney gathering, and it was about 2 million people around the world. So I think it shows that leadership is changing. It is a whole different model. I think it's remiss not to mention some pretty poor leadership that we've also seen this year. So the perennially atrocious Donald Trump, of course, but interesting, a little bit more close to home, WeWork's Adam Newman was forced out of the company, and I think it was really interesting, just that fall kind of from grace, but also how it can really affect a company's performance. And then I wasn't aware of this one, but Carlos Ghosn of Nissan Motors had concealed almost 150 million in executive compensation and retirement benefits. So there's some really bad stuff that actually does happen in the name of leadership as well. So I think there's definitely a changing of the guard, but also a changing in that whole archetype of what a leader makes. And I have 3 outstanding examples of leadership here. So with no further ado, I'd like to invite each of them. Peter Tonagh first, if you come to the stage. I'm going to get you nice and close. So Peter's a prominent, I don't want to embarrass you by listing all these amazing things, but he is a prominent business leader, amazing connector as well of people, and so many incredible people that are in your little black book. But Peter is a former executive. He was a CEO of both Foxtel and News Corp, and also had multiple, I don't want to keep reading this, you all know about it. He's pretty amazing, but his role now is with Australian Visa Processing, which is a really exciting kind of conglomeration of lots of very blue chip companies. And also is non-executive chairman of Bus Stop Films, and they do some work upstairs. We really like seeing the guys that come through. Village Roadshow, and also a member of the Council of AFTAs. So please welcome Peter to be here. Thank you, Peter. And Felicity, who spilt her drink on my paper, so it's sabotaging me. Felicity she's not only clumsy, but she's an authority on cultural intelligence, diversity and inclusion in the corporate environment. So it's a fascinating story just from, we'll hear about it, but Felicity's experiences as the head of private banking Westpac in Singapore really caused a great pivot for her in what she's done with her career. And she went on and studied, and has now spurred her to look at the interplay between culture and leadership. So she has also written a book, which we'll talk about, but just showing how cultural intelligence is that new secret weapon in business, and not just about positive workplace, but about profit, which is super important for bankers. So please, Felicity, come to the stage. And coming close, do that. And so Dom Taylor from Uber, Dom got his start driving an Uber Holden Capri. No, he didn't. No, seriously. So Dom is the newly promoted General Manager for Australia and New Zealand of one of the world's most ubiquitous brands, which is pretty incredible to have you here. So he joined Uber when there was only about 6 or a handful of employees, and now there's 600. And it's pretty incredible, the stats of Uber going from strength to strength. So my former neighbour and head of Uber in Australia, Dom Taylor. So, welcome everyone. I think being a leader, it's super important to be self-reflective and kind of self-aware. So I would love to put each of you on the spot and tell me your leadership style. So I'm wondering if, Peter, we can start with you, and what's your unique style of leadership?
Well, I think it's a very hard question for a leader, because I think your style changes to suit the context.
Sure.
And I think if I think back to very early in my career, I was the hard-nosed numbers guy and was very much focused on, is the performance there, that sort of thing. And I'd say I've completely pivoted that, and I focus much, much less time on that now. And I describe myself, that evolution for me is becoming a really authentic leader. So what you see is what you get. I am who I am. I'm much more inclusive than I used to be, and I'm much more focused on a drive to make people feel inspired and optimistic about the business they're working in. Now, that may have come because when you work for businesses under pressure, like News Corporation in newspaper publishing or in pay TV, there's no time for reflecting on the bad parts of the business. Those businesses are being disrupted. But what I find is if you can inspire people by the potential future and focus them on building optimism back into the business, then you get a much better outcome. So I've probably become much more focused on that than I was in the past.
Very good. And I can vouch for that, because we eyeball each other every morning, and I think you're an incredible leader. So Felicity, on to you.
Oh, I agree with Peter. I think it's about setting a really clear vision and then being very clear in your values, which is how you're going to achieve that vision. But then what I'd add to that is trust. So trusting your team that they have the ideas and they have the ability to meet that vision without you needing to always look over their shoulder. But at the same time, they can trust me, or they can trust their leader to be there to give them support when they need it. Yeah. So.
And vice versa, you trusting in the people around
and
you.
It's very important in the diversity inclusion space now, which is where I specialise, trust, because we talk a lot about creating flexible workplaces, setting very clear KPIs, and that vision is very important for that. And then you just let people go and do the work, how and when and where they want to do that work. And that creates a really engaged team.
So less of the micromanaging.
Much less of the micromanaging.
And then, Dom, you've got a similar start to Peter with the numbers.
Yeah, I'm probably still in the numbers stage, Peter, so I can look forward to that.
I'm saying it's not important.
Yeah. But yeah, I think these guys have touched on the big ideas of authenticity and being yourself in everything you do. I just got changed out of my shorts and runners, that's the way I work every day, because that's how I feel comfortable. And I think the most important thing is that your team feels comfortable. And somewhere like Uber is a fairly intense place to work, and it's a place where we drive rapid experimentation, change constantly. And unless your team feels safe and feels adequate to fail, then they won't move fast. And so I think it's down to the leader to be able to set the tone in terms of people having that safety to be themselves, but then also to be bold enough to be making calls that will help them, that will mean sometimes they fail, but dust the gloves off and get up and go again and fail again until you get it, and then you get it right, and then you go hard at whatever worked.
And I think that is almost a bigger story of Uber as a brand, not just the individual. So we'll come back to that. So for tonight, I want to almost have the construct of the key things that are really important for leadership. And the first one is about capability. And Peter, you've got a Bachelor of Commerce, you've got an MBA from Europe's leading business school. So we've talked about the numbers being really important. So is that kind of a prerequisite for anyone going into a lead CEO type of role?
I don't think it's a prerequisite to have studied it, but I think it's a prerequisite to understand the dynamics of the business that you're running. You need to understand what's going to make it successful. And unless you understand those drivers, it's incredibly difficult to manage a business effectively for the long term. Sure. But it's certainly not sufficient. So I'd say you need to have that, but just knowing the numbers, just focusing on the numbers isn't going to drive success in a business. It takes much more than that.
Yeah. And then Felicity, I'll jump you while we've fixed your sound. So for Dom, you were also studied accounting and then commerce here in Australia and then went to Oxford to study economics. So, and we didn't touch on it, but you were working as an analyst and sort of in that very high-powered kind of banking world. So how did you transition into an Uber role?
Yeah, so the only slight nuance that I was studying economic history, and the reason why I think that's important is that I think that the key skill of a good leader is to be a good storyteller, and that's what history and studying economic history taught me. And then I came back as an analyst at a stockbroking firm, and in a way, you know, when you're sitting at Oxford and you're writing about the European economy between the wars, you're up against the guy at MIT and Yale, and you're trying to work out how I spin a yarn that's more interesting than the other two guys. And then you come back and you're sitting at Morgan Stanley and you're up against Goldman's and Macquarie Bank trying to work out how I tell a better story than the other guy. And then coming to Uber, it was basically saying, how do I come back and tell stories? And how do I use data to tell stories? And how do I take all these learnings and be able to manipulate data to be able to tell the most interesting story and get to the right story, essentially.
Yeah. I love it. It's almost the humanities and the science, that blend of the two coming together. So the second thing then I want to look at is character. So we've looked at that capability and sort of those aptitudes, but character is really important. And Don, I might head down to you because you know with Uber it's had its share of controversy. And what's the difference with character of kind of from Travis to now Dara, who's CEO, and how has that changed, I guess, the process of the company?
We've got more controversy today, actually. So losing the license in London, but. Yeah, I mean, so I joined, just for everyone, I joined back in 2014 and Dara got kicked out around 2016, and so there's been two distinct CEOs of the company. Travis, who was the founder, hothead, tried to turn the business into a day trade, an algorithmic trading business of trying to work out how we perfectly optimize supply and demand, and everything was incredibly intensely numbers focused, which to some extent it still is, but really so focused on, I guess, the what and really gave lack of thought about the how and what was going on in terms of what was that encouraging in terms of culture, what was that encouraging in terms of cultural norms and how people interacted, how people talked to each other, the expectations people had on various people. Long story short, one of the biggest venture capital firms, Benchmark Capital, led a movement to shift the CEO out, and in came Booking.com CEO Dara, a man of Iranian descent who came to America as a refugee, and has subsequently, him and most of his brothers and sisters have all done amazingly well in the American business world. But the shift that occurs in a company with the change of a leader was just unbelievable. And it was an adult coming in essentially. And there was poise and there was calm. And one of the first things he did was get on a plane to London after we lost our license for the first time, and said to Transport for London, we fucked up here, I'm sorry. Let's talk about what we're doing wrong and how we can improve this relationship. He probably didn't swear. I shouldn't have sworn. And it was that, just awareness and maturity to go, we haven't done everything right here. Let's work out what we've done right and then how do we move on from here. And then to really go about and say there's some problems, some deep-seated problems in this organisation, but there's also a lot of greatness there. How do we keep this greatness and make it bigger? And then how do we also work out the things that are sort of cancerous issues within the organisation that we have to cut and get rid of fairly quickly? And so he's still brutal at times, and he's kicked out the CMO and COO in the last 12 months. And so when something isn't working, he still has the passion, the energy and acumen, I guess, to get rid of something that's not working. But he also has that softer side that he can see how important it is to be creating this inclusive, diverse group of minds, of great minds around him, that we're going to get to the right answer if we've got a lot of good people thinking about these things.
And it was such a good response when Dom and I were talking about it earlier. Just you're saying he's worth every cent, like just unequivocally, he's worth it for the company.
No, it's unbelievable how much the whole business can change off one person, and thousands of miles away. Yeah.
So Peter, if we shift to Foxtel and News Corp, there's been a lot of CEOs through that time, and I want to find out from you, how was it difficult to kind of come into legacy company and work out what that company needed at the time, and to sort of implement your style of leadership?
Yeah, so I might start with News Corp. News Corp was a particular example where Kim Williams, who was the CEO before me, had done all of the hard work, basically. So he'd come into that business and he'd developed the plan, he'd made all the decisions, he'd told everyone the decisions, and then he got rejected by the business. And that's because when you're trying to change a business, it's incredibly difficult when it's a legacy of huge success. In my view, his biggest failing was that he listened to all of the management textbooks that say you should create a burning platform. And so he went in and he got all the evidence, all the communication about why the business was stuffed, and then said, now I want you to change. So when I arrived, I took completely the opposite approach. I still used his strategy, but we went in and took the view of we wanted to create a burning desire or a burning ambition about where the business could be, rather than create this burning platform. And the reason for that is because in an instance where you have to transform a business, you need people to change. If you need people to change, you have to remove the fear, because the first thing that happens when people are fearful for their jobs or fearful for what the future holds is they dig their heels in, particularly if it's an older workforce, and they say, well, I dig my heels in and we'll get another CEO and another CEO and another CEO in 5 years' time, I'll retire. There's no incentive to change. Sure. And so we decided we were going to create a burning desire for what the business could be. And then during that period, I developed a very simple approach, which I know is applied by many other CEOs, but I thought of it as the purpose, the plan, and the playbook. And so we created a purpose, new purpose for the organisation. We created a plan, which was very, very simple. There were 3 core pillars and 3 initiatives in each, so only 9 things you had to remember to understand everything about what we were changing in the business. And then we created what we called the playbook, which was just the values, you might call it, or the principles, or the way we work around here. And then we, having developed that with some focus groups, we then took it on a roadshow and we went around to every one of the 7,000 employees in the business and presented it to them, including going out to the print sites in Chullora at midnight to present to the printers after they had, when they were between shifts. Yeah. And so it was very much about taking a strategy which in itself was very good and had been well thought out but had been rejected, and refreshing it and using the words that made a difference to the team and made the team confident about the future, and portraying it not as everything is stuffed, you have to change, but more about imagine if we could be like this, and so we're going to change. Yeah. And that made a big difference. And then when I went across to Foxtel, they were in a very similar position, and so I did exactly the same thing with the purpose, the plan, and the playbook. The only thing is that rather than doing it as I'd done it at News Corp, starting with the executive team and then running some focus groups, I took a cross-section from the business of 70 people from a vertical slice of the business rather than a hierarchical, horizontal slice. And so we had people from the call centre, we had people who were our installation contractors, we had people from the Philippines and from South Africa from our call centre, and brought them all across, and we ran a 2-day workshop where we got them heavily engaged in the business and developed out what I already knew I wanted to have, which was the purpose, the plan and the playbook, but got a lot of involvement from all of the staff in that. And then having developed that, we then did the same thing, but instead of having half-hour presentations to everyone, we had half-day workshops in groups of 30 or 40 people for all 3,000 people around the business, led by at least one of the executive team and one of the senior management team. So they could see the people would often be maybe coming from different angles together, presenting in front of the staff. And it gave us a lot of credibility. It showed that we had a cohesive management team, and it showed that we cared enough to go and share it with the staff.
Yeah, amazing.
So it was a great learning for me in shifting from all the analysis and the data that I used to focus on to come up with the right answer being 90% of the effort, to that being 20% of the effort, and the selling of it and the ingraining of it being 80% of the effort.
Incredible. And I think it flows really well into, Felicity, the work that you're doing, and maybe you can share your didactic in the framework that you go in, because you're trying to change companies as well with your work.
Yeah, no, what Dom and Peter have both said really resonates with the work that I do. So I do a lot of diagnostic work, speaking to employees in organisations, to get some qualitative data to explain what we're seeing through the engagement surveys. And back to your question about the character of, a strong leader or a good leader, effective leader. What I hear come through time and time again is a leader that has the ability to foster psychologically safe settings, which you both touched on, where people feel safe to speak up. And there's a study done in Australia just a couple of years ago by Are You OK and APA that showed that only 24% of Australian workers feel safe to speak up at work. So that's 76% of Australian workers are sitting there not saying anything, not adding any innovative potential, just doing their job. It's just a huge loss of talent. So for me, an effective leader is a leader that knows how to tap into that and to make sure that all those voices are heard and then integrated into decision making. And that normally, the character traits that are normally associated with that, and they can be developed. So it's not that you have to be born as a leader, they can be developed, is empathy, which is lacking in all of those bad leadership examples that you shared and in our current political climate. And humility, so knowing that you don't have all the answers. So as Peter did, reaching to the rest of the organisation and as you did too, reaching across and down and hearing everyone else's ideas. And emotionally, regulating your emotions, that is a big one. Like leaders that vent or express their frustrations create a very scary workplace for everyone else. And emotions are contagious. And when people are in flight and fight mode, they're not productive. So if you have a workforce which is constantly scared about their jobs or about their leaders walking on eggshells, then you have got an unperforming workforce. So I think primary as a leader, it's about being calm. And if I asked all of you, who have you most enjoyed working for? I bet the person that comes front of mind is that calm, which is what the word that you used for when you described Uber's leadership now. Calm, poise, yeah.
And then almost as a flip to that, how do you make sure that there's still this galvanising and forward momentum rather than just sort of this laissez-faire style of business?
Back to me?
You, yeah.
Yeah, so psychological safety isn't about, and this is what Amy Edmondson says, who is the lead researcher on the topic, it's not about being nice. It's about being candid and almost an obligation that for the sake of the work, people have to be candid and know that they can be candid without any negative repercussions to their psychological well-being or to their financial security. So it's setting, again, I think it's setting the scene. It's saying we want to hear from everyone. This is part of the job and this is a part of the way we work. And it's criticising the ideas, not the person. And just making it a part of the culture and the everyday that you work. And that to get from sort of mediocre to great, we have to have this conversation. And we have to pull apart ideas because that's how you innovate and get better ideas.
And I don't know if you said this, but it was that brutal honesty, kind of making sure that you were just always being honest and telling the truth.
I think the other thing that's important there is, I know we sort of had a laugh the start about micromanagement. And I think micromanagement has a bit of a misnomer as well, that there's also a role for a great leader to go deep in something and to really get involved. And the last thing is you want a boss or a leader that is just standing back and letting the wind flow, and no one ever feels better than when they have a boss that's deep in the trenches with them trying to get to the bottom of a problem, you know? And so there's just that slight nuance, I think, around the leader still has to be driving towards the right answer at the end of the day.
And that's our third thing, so thanks for bringing that up, following my notes. So it's about being strategic and being visionary, and I think not just being a figurehead that kind of keeps safe, but I think every business nowadays, it needs that momentum forward. So Peter, maybe if we come back to you, you were very involved for Foxtel with their overall strategy and some incredible outcomes that you had there. So when you took that direction, did you need the support of the board? You were consulting with him. Maybe talk us through how you made your strategies.
So I think, first of all, in a very engaging way, I think is probably the best way of describing it, and engaging people from all levels of the organisation. As I mentioned before, bringing 70 people together and then having kind of formed the draft of the strategy, then going around and selling it to 3,000. You get a lot of feedback and you get a lot of input and you get a lot of buy-in, which is the most important thing. I think if I had to reflect on the thing that I probably didn't do as well as I should have, is managing upwards as well as downwards in terms of that strategy, and making sure that everyone up the chain was all as aligned as the people down the chain were, because clearly, particularly in a business that's being disrupted, you need to be persistent, you need to make some hard calls, and inevitably some of those hard calls are going to upset people. And I think you can never underestimate how much effort has to go into managing everyone around you, both up and beside and down, to make sure that when you make those hard calls that they're being embraced, and not just people nodding and saying, yes, that's a good idea, but people who really recognise, yes, I agree, that has to be done, and it's going to be difficult and it's going to be painful, but I'm behind you and I'm going to support you on it. And so I think you need to think about each of those stakeholder groups and manage them very carefully. Yeah,
definitely. And Felicity, for you, when you're dealing with companies with boards, how much do you get any sort of influence with the boards when you go into these blue chip companies?
Look, I do, but most of the work I do with boards is around diversity and inclusion rather than strategy. But if I can share, I had the pleasure of listening to Indra Nooyi, ex-CEO of PepsiCo, and now on the board of Amazon, talk about her leadership. And what I thought was really a great takeaway was that she said at PepsiCo they were very rigorous about looking at and studying the mega trends, the future trends hitting the business. So we know through McKinsey research that the world is changing at 3,000 times the pace that it ever did before, or in the Industrial Revolution. So you can't set a strategy based on the past. You have to have your eyes wide open and be looking at what are those global mega trends, one of which is diversity of markets, of people and of ideas. Well,
let's unpack that. What's the benefit of diversity in a commercial sense?
Diversity in a workforce, firstly, there's a war on talent and it's pretty dire. So I think 40% of large companies in Australia have trouble filling open roles. So when you start getting a little bit more creative about who you can hire and you're not looking for people to fit inside the box, suddenly you have a much greater pool of talent to recruit from. So we know, for example, in Australia that there's a huge problem with ageism. And that people above 45 are finding it really hard to get work. And yet there's all these companies claiming that they can't fill open roles. To me, there's a real disconnect there, and maybe companies need to drop some of their biases and preconceptions about what makes an effective worker. Then the second benefit is if you have a diverse workforce that reflects your market place, then you're better able to service their needs or to tap new markets. And then the third is really powerful, is diversity of thought and the ability to innovate and bring new ideas to the table. And also that when you have a group of people, the studies show when you've got a group of people around the table who are different to one another, have different backgrounds or look different, it just jolts everyone into higher levels of cognitive sophistication and higher levels of strategic thinking. So you get better outcomes. You decrease the risk of groupthink and this lazy kind of, okay, let's do that. You really start to analyse some of your decisions.
And it's interesting that Australia is one of the most diverse nations in the world. It's second with Luxembourg, but the first was Switzerland, which is often quite Europeanly diverse, but nothing else. So, but yet you came back and you found in the corporate environment it was very non-diverse.
So as Tim Sapomasan, who's our ex-Race Discrimination Commissioner, says, our boardrooms look nothing like Pitt Street Mall.
Yeah, it's true, it's an issue. But Dom, if you, we look at the example of Susan Anderson, so now she's the Uber head for Asia Pacific, and she's a great example of someone that's really passionate about this diversity. What she brought to the table as far as the direction with Uber?
Yeah, a huge amount. She's my boss as well, so I'm being recorded. But just building on what Felicity talked about, the first leadership team I was a member at Uber in 2016. I remember it clearly, there was 9 people sitting around the table. All of them were white males, and all of them probably went to the same 2 or 3 schools, I think even down to that sort of extent. And then fast forward today, we've got many amazing women, many amazing, from all walks of life, from all different countries around the world, lots of different ages. And I think the important thing is yes, we do get to a lot better answers now, but there is moments where it's a bit icky and it's a little bit hard, and there's more confrontation and there's more pushback. And so some people might think, and they walk out of a meeting going, oh God, that was tough. But that's sort of the beauty of it, that it's that rigor and clash of minds that actually help you get to the better answer faster, which I don't think is talked about as much in diversity and inclusion, is that's actually sort of the brilliance of it, that it doesn't feel as safe. It does not safe. It doesn't feel as easy. Yeah.
But it can be safe.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, definitely
that's
safe.
the inclusion part.
Yeah. And I also want to cast it wider than just the 600 working here in Australia, but the 70,000 people that drive in cars. There's inclusion because you often have hearing impaired drivers, or I think 3/4 of the drivers do this because it's flexible for their kind of lifestyle with parents. So what are the pillars? We talked about the pillars here. For Uber, what are the brand pillars that they base a lot of their work on?
I think one, I used to run our driver onboarding or driver team, or trying to grow the number of drivers we had, and we sort of looked around and we said, the majority of our driver partners in Australia are recent migrants, who majority English is their second language, and we sort of looked at the way that we talk to them, and we were sending them a weekly P&L. It was really like Google writing to you once a year about the changes, terms and conditions, and so we said, how do we strip this right back, and how do we talk to drivers about what they're interested in? And I think the key that we've come back to is that these men and women aren't employees, they're contractors. But how do we create a hybrid in the way that we think about employment, such that we can create flexibility and that people can come online whenever they want, and if they go on holidays they don't need to tell us, but they're still afforded the same sort of support and safety and structure, that if something goes wrong, we've got their back as well. And within the confines of an employment legal setting, that's quite a tricky act, but it's trying to say, there needs to be this mid ground between employment and contractor, where you're able to have the flexibility, but you still can enjoy benefits like the minimum wage, or start to look at things about workers' comp and things like that, and building out a fully fledged new form of working, I guess.
And you guys are almost the example of the gig economy in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Peter, I want to give you a chance to talk about Bus Stop Films, because that's an incredible story of diversity. Tell us about it.
So Bus Stop Films is a not-for-profit organisation. We effectively teach intellectually disabled young adults how to make screen content. And so we have a 40-week curriculum, and we get mostly young adults with autism and teach them how to make film, and then at the end of each semester actually produce a film. And the most important thing is we're just unrelenting on quality. So we only produce quality content. That's why we've won 50 awards around the world at international film festivals and exhibited 300 films at 300 different events.
And you won a Human Rights Award.
And we won a Human
well.
Rights Award for the stuff that we're doing. And we've got incredible growth. We started about we've been going for 10 years, but we started about 2 years ago. When I joined the board, we had 2 courses that we ran at the entertainment quarter, and this year we're running them 3 courses at the entertainment quarter, 1 in Parramatta, 1 in Wollongong. We just launched in Canberra, and we run a course in Mongolia, which is an unusual place to run a course. But the principle that we operate under is we want to educate these young adults and teach them that, give them confidence basically so they can go into other roles. The second thing we want to do is advocate for inclusion in filmmaking. And it's a very simple proposition, which is if you make a film and it stars someone with autism, then the person who fills that role should be someone with autism. And equally, if it's somebody who is hearing impaired, you should make the person who stars in that film hearing impaired. Yeah. And we advocate very strongly for that and are getting some great success. And then the third thing we do is we look for career pathways for the kids that go through our courses. And those career pathways often end up with them having jobs in film production. And we prove that it's not a burden, it's actually a benefit, the benefit of diversity, of having those people involved in the filmmaking process. And if they don't work in filmmaking, then many of them will go off and get other jobs. So, one of our ambassadors is a young lady who works in a legal firm in the city, and it was always her ambition. She wanted to work in an office in the city. She's achieved that ambition. And so she's gone from a young lady who, when she was born, her mother was told that she'd never amount to anything. And she now MCs our events. She's just flown to Toronto, to the Toronto International Film Festival to accept an award, and has this great job. So
I might give up my seat for her. That's so great. I'm going to ask a question which I haven't prepped you for, but I'd really love to find your dark leadership moments, if I might. So we talked about a lot of the positive things. So maybe you can think of something where because a lot of this, it's a school of hard knocks, a lot of leadership you're learning on the job. So Felicity, I can probably think in Singapore there was a big learning curve for you. But who wants to jump first with that? Go, Felicity.
I know which one you're talking about, but I was thinking of another one. It was in Singapore, and it was I think it was a lesson I had to learn was how to deal with change, and I didn't deal with. There was an organisational restructure, and I didn't deal with it very well, and it had an impact on my career. Yeah, and I realised then, wow, I'm a little bit stuck in my kind of, you have to be agile in this environment to survive. So luckily I learnt that earlier in my career. And then I look back, like what I've done since then, and I've just been flexing left, right, centre, like wherever, like whatever happens, I just keep moving to that sort of area. And I think that is the future of work. Like we're not going to have one career. And I mean, I was a chartered accountant, then I was a banker, I was a trader, then I was a private banker, then I went back to university and I retrained as a psychologist, and then I started consultancy, and originally it was a cross-cultural consultancy, and now it's a full-fledged diversity inclusion consultancy. Now I do a lot more leadership work, and it's just kind of like continuous learning. So I think that would be probably where I'm getting at, is out of that darkness I realised I couldn't stand still. Like you actually have to keep learning. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a good memory. There's this, I'm sure everyone's heard of it, there's this thing called intermittent fasting where you don't eat for 16 hours. And so you've got about from 8 p.m. to 12 noon, you don't eat. Anyway, I just got in the role and it was 11:30 a.m. So it was half an hour before I had my first meal. So my blood sugar was pretty low at this moment. And a crisis happened, and a crisis room was called, and everyone came into their room, and it was my first time in the crisis room. And the person that was running the crisis room said, we need to make 3 decisions, X, Y, and Z, and the decision maker on all 3 of these decisions is Dom. And everyone just looked at me, And at that moment, my blood sugar just fell through the roof. And it was a good realization for me that as a leader, you have to be very steady, and you've got to be out. You can't have your moments of, I don't know, being hungover at work on a day, or you've got to be there to be able to fully deliver and make good decisions, and people are really relying on you, and there's really big table stakes at hand here. So I scrapped intermittent fasting after that. It didn't work anyway.
But it is a responsibility to health and well-being and your relationships around you as well.
Exactly, and you've got to, as Felicity said, anyone that's stressed, that's running a team, their team's going to be stressed. And so it's the most important person that a leader can look after is themselves, and be finding time to run or meditate or whatever it is that makes them, centered and grounded, and be able to provide that empathy and poise for their team.
So we say in the leadership coaching world, it's about how you show up as a leader, and just being really cognizant of that, when you walk into the office every day, which is kind of ironic that then we're wanting everyone else to bring them whole selves to work and we're showing up. But I think that was how I was going to answer Naomi's last question is, what's your leadership manifesto is self-care.
Yeah.
Exactly
beautiful.
like what you said. If you don't look after yourself, then let's care for others and care for yourself.
Yeah, because that was my real question, is to kind of come back to what is that manifesto. So Peter, maybe you give us your dark story of leadership, and then we'll
dark
run
story of
through
leadership.
that.
So I mentioned earlier, I've got this strong belief you've got to focus on optimism and positivity. So it's not really a dark story, but it was a dark moment that led to a positive. But most of you are probably aware of the News Corp bent in terms of the way they lean. And so one of the big issues for me at Foxtel was the marriage equality vote. And so I'm a very strong advocate for marriage equality. And so in my view were most of the people in the organisation. And so I decided that we were going to take a very active stance, and we were going to actively promote. We're going to provide advertising time. We're going to actively promote the yes vote. And that was something I believed in very strongly, but I knew News Corp as a business didn't, and they were the major shareholder. But it was also something where there was a lot of argument, particularly at the Business Council of Australia, about the fact that organisations shouldn't take a social stance and should focus on running their businesses. Something that, as an aside, I fundamentally disagree with, and I think that if we as business leaders are going to put standards on our politicians, then we have to take those same standards on ourselves. And so I was very active in the Yes campaign, both in providing support, but also very vocally advocating and signing letters. And equally with our staff, being very, very clear with our staff that the thing I value more than marriage equality is the freedom of opinion and speech. Sure. And so we made it very clear to every staff member they were entitled to have whatever view they wanted, but that we as an organisation were going to stand for the yes vote. And I got letters from archbishops, and I got letters from politicians, and I got letters from subscribers who were going to disconnect their service. And it was, for a while, a really dark time for me where I was getting beaten up on all sides, because you hear always from the negative and don't necessarily hear from the positive. But to me, the impact of actually taking that stance had a massive impact on the organisation as a whole. Now, I would say that Foxtel was probably 95% of the people who work in that business voted yes. And I think they appreciated that I was willing to take a stand. Yeah. And it was very positive for me as a leader of that business. It led to them having a different view, I think, of me as a leader, sure, and listening to my opinions on other things more than they may have in the past. So it was a dark moment for a period, but it was definitely a bright moment in my career.
And I think it is part of this whole thing is about bringing your humanity to work as well. So if I can ask for the manifesto, so Felicity, yours is about self-care.
Yeah, care for others, but that also has to extend to care for yourself, yeah, because it's like put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can help others.
Yeah, perfect.
Exactly like
John.
Peter's.
Yeah, I think it's... To add something new on, it's not becoming someone you're not, and not becoming the textbook and not answering something in a way because you read that's how I should answer it. It's being real and knowing your stuff inside out, and also evolving the tone and the way you talk for your audience, obviously, but also being true to yourself as well.
And then Peter.
It's a very dangerous thing to ask me because I've written my manifesto of leadership. So, so I've got, there's 5 things that I think I stand for leadership, and I won't go over all 5 because we don't have time.
But just tell us.
The first one for me is know who you are and what you stand for. And I think that's really important because it's about authenticity, but it's also about quick decision making. And if you don't know what you stand for, as a CEO, you get swamped with, and it's probably the thing I notice most as a CEO is that I had hundreds and hundreds of decisions to make every day. And if I wasn't able to have a set of principles that I judged them by, I would have not been able to make decisions. I would have been paralysed by that. That's kind of how am I going to answer this? So knowing who you are and what you stand for is really important. So for me, that's number 1. Maybe I'll do 2 or 3.
Yes, please. I think we can do 5, right? So, we'll just waive the questions. So
the second thing for me is, as I mentioned before, to build a burning desire, not a burning platform. And that's about the optimism you need in an organisation. Without that optimism, there's no chance of survival, I don't think. The third thing for me is a very simple principle, but a very important principle, and the phrasing of it's probably not quite right, but that it's okay to be better off, but you can never be better than. And to me, that's a really important principle that I think as a leader in a business, there's nothing wrong with recognising that you are better off, you're getting paid well, you're getting rewarded, but equally it's incredibly important to know that you can never be better than the other people in the organisation. And so I always spend a lot of time with the people in our call centre. I always spend a lot of time with the more junior people in the organisation. Even tonight, before I came here, I called a very junior person who used to work for me, who I know has an illness now. And I think just that recognition that you need to have that humanity, bring that humanity to work is really important. The fourth thing, which actually touches on a number of things we've spoken about, and this is actually a quote from Hillary Clinton, I believe, who says, follow the trend lines, not the headlines. And to me, particularly in a very public organisation, that's really important because you'll hear a whole bunch of feedback, you read about your company in the news, there's a whole bunch of pressure to change what you're doing. And just being willing to say, actually, I'm just going to follow the trend line and I'm going to have that calm equanimity of spirit where I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing as long as I know it's right. And I'm going to stop people from overreacting, keep them on the steady path, I think is one of the most important traits in a leader. And then the final thing, my fifth thing I think is very important, is what I call being match fit. And I think that's about, as an individual, the self-care and making sure that you maintain a level of health and well-being, but also as an organisation, making sure the organisation is always driving to be as fit as it can be so it's agile and able to adapt. So that's my 5 principles.
I feel that was just absolute leadership gold. So I will end it there unless anyone wants to jump up with a really quick question. I think we've gone over a little bit. We're right on time. So I think please thank this incredible panel up here. It's all the things that we've talked about. I think you read about Brené Brown and this idea of humanity and kind of humility and being brave and courageous. So I really feel that's embodied, and it's great kind of trend for future Australian companies. So this is the final one, like I said, for the year, but stay tuned. We've got really exciting things planned for 2020 for next decade. But really, again, thank you so much for being here tonight. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Insight Business Podcast. To find out more about the podcast, future Insight events, and the Sydney Community Foundation, please visit our website, insight.theofficespace.com.au. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on your favourite listening platform.